Good morning. I'm Stas Margaronis with the Propeller Club of Northern California, and I am honored to have our esteemed guest, John Mccown of the Mccown Report with us today. He's going to be giving us his analysis of what is happening with the container volumes for the rest of the year, as well as giving us some insights into the Jones Act waivers, and we will be with that in a minute. As you know, the way we start our meetings is that we introduce everybody, and I had a couple of late entries, which I hope those two people got on. And so what I'm going to do is I will start as I usually do with Todd Crawshaw, who is our IT guy, and without him, a lot of things here would not happen. So, Todd, good morning, and thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Toss. Yes, I have Crawshaw Design as our business, full digital media and web hosting company, and more.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. And John McGowan. John, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, John Mccown. Very pleased to be with all of y'all.
Thank you. Peter Dreyfus. Peter, good morning.
Good morning, Admiral. Hi. I am Peter Dreyfus with Watermaster North America. We manufacture a 40-foot dredger that is Jones Act compliant, imported, designed from Finland.
But actually, this week, you don't need to be Jones Act compliant because there's a waiver. And John's about to talk to you about that, actually.
I know.
He's got a message for you, Peter.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much. Bruce Heyman. Bruce, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Bruce Heyman. I'm in LALB. We have 3 tall ships, and we serve between 5,000 and 7,000 middle school and high school kids a year. We export them in the morning and re-import them later that day. I'm trying to figure out how to get that to count for TEUs, but welcome, everybody.
Bruce, what does LAMI stand for?
Los Angeles Maritime Institute.
And where are you located?
We have 2 vessels on the main channel and 1 in Rainbow Harbor in Long Beach.
Great. Well, we're very pleased to have you with us, and hopefully we can bring some of your young people at some point.
That's all the goal. I'm getting your future employees excited right now.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Dennis Dysinger. Dennis, good morning.
Hey, Stas, semi-retired, still doing a little bit of consulting and poking the bear like you, and trying to stay relevant in the maritime space.
Very good, Dennis. And I saw that the efforts by California Tomorrow to get a shipyard ended up going to Brownsville. Did you follow that?
Yes. It was a long stretch to even think about it, but here we are.
Let me think. Well, yes. Okay. Jackson Fox.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm here in New York. Don't ask me how I got involved with the Propeller Club of California. I don't know. I'm a Tulane law student. I'm going into my 3rd year, and I'm working at a maritime firm in New York called Freehill, Hogan and Mahar, and excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
You're welcome, and we're very pleased to have you, Jackson. Kevin Policarpo.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Policarpo. I work as Mr. Stas's research assistant.
Very good. Thank you. Peter Schrappen. Peter, are you there?
Greetings. Hi there. Peter Schrappen, American Waterways Operators. Thanks, Stas.
You're welcome, Peter. We've been having a very busy time on these waivers.
Exactly.
And hopefully we're going to get a resolution to this pretty soon, because we know that they're making a decision in Washington, and hopefully our side is going to win. We'll see. And I know that you guys have been doing a lot of really good, important work, and we are grateful to AWO for all of the work you've done on the Jones Act.
Thanks, Stas.
You're welcome. Thank you. Tony Petronio.
Good morning, Stas. Good morning, everybody. Tony Petronio with Storm Geo. I'm the operations director for the Routing Advisory Services Group, and we provide weather routing and forecast support worldwide.
Very good. So I am going to ask you guys to hold for just a second here because I have somebody who says that he was not included, and he's right. And I just sent it to him. Okay. So let me just tell him that he's in. Greg, if you're hearing me, I just sent you your entrance, and let me just say, just sent. Okay. All right, guys. So, Tony, quick question. How is do we have any big weather events going on in the Pacific this week?
I don't know if you guys saw, but we actually just had a typhoon make landfall very close to Hong Kong. Not too much of an impact for us because it was a fairly straightforward track through the South China Sea. But earlier in the month, we had another typhoon, Typhoon Bobby, that went north of Taiwan, that also was causing a lot of issues for us. And the Chinese government issued a directive to ships to follow some certain traffic control through Taiwan Strait, and that kind of threw a little bit of a wrench for us. That's something we hadn't really seen before, trying to control traffic through the northern Taiwan Strait. And what authority they have it and all that. So that led to some interesting decisions from captains, but definitely something we'll have to keep watch on if future typhoons impact that area.
Yeah, and we've had a report that the Chinese Coast Guard is going to be taking a more active role in the Taiwan Strait, which will also be an interesting situation for us. And another reason why we should be having naval assets in the Pacific where they're needed rather than where they are, where the issue is more in doubt. In any case, Tony, one other question. Do we have any sense that earthquake in Japan has generated a tsunami?
A tsunami warning was issued. I don't know if there was any specific report of a tsunami. It looked like it was kind of in the center of the island. And my guess is it didn't produce a large tsunami, but probably maybe a local tsunami was generated there. But I don't think there's anything significant, at least that I've seen. But yeah, that was a pretty insane thing to see last night when that happened.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
Tony, thank you very much, as always, for all of your support for the Propeller Club and keeping us abreast of what's going on our weather and our climate. Good to
Our
see you.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to introduce our guest. John Mccown is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Maritime Strategy. He's also the author of the Mccown Report, which is widely read and quoted and reports on container volume and sector results. He's a recognized expert in container shipping with 4 decades of senior operating investment experience. And I often interview him when I am confused about what's going on. And since we have a lot of mixed signals around tariffs, just as for instance, and why we're getting another possible Jones Act waiver, I thought it would be good for us to hear from John and have him elucidate the mysteries that are presently in front of us. So without further ado, John Mccown, good morning and welcome to the Propeller Club of Northern California.
Thank you, Taz. Very, very pleased to be here. I was thinking this morning, I think my first exposure to the shipping industry goes back, 60 years ago when I the few times when I was in Mobile, Alabama, watching TV late, and you got to the 12 o'clock sign off, and there'd be a short video of the Propeller Club, and I think I asked my dad what that was, but so I'm very pleased to be here. Let me see how can everybody see the slides, or
We
do we
cannot see the slides.
Not
Oh,
yet.
okay. Let me. Oh, I've got to share the slides. Okay, let me. Okay, I'm sharing.
Okay, we're beginning to see something. There we
Okay.
go. We got it.
Okay.
Good.
Excellent. Excellent. So again, very pleased to be here and talk about the Jones Act waiver and uh, 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 what. Wait a second. Let me. Okay. The Jones Act waiver and kind of what's going on in the container sector. On the Jones Act waiver, in March, middle of March, the administration announced a 60-day waiver. It surprised a lot of us. Barely halfway through that, in April, they announced that it'd be extended another 90 days. Again, kind of a month before it extended. So right now, the waiver goes until the middle of August. Another, what is that, 3 weeks from now. So far, there have been 185 voyages that have been granted under that waiver. 27% of those voyages had linkage to China. And what's striking to me in going through so many of the individual waivers is kind of the atypical routing. A lot of them were very short voyages, things that you wouldn't naturally see. Quite a few kind of short inbound voyages to California from Washington. I'll get into what my view of that is, but again, it has little to do with any underlying need. The other thing about the waivers that was really unprecedented was the scope of what they included. In the past, the waivers have always been very narrow, targeted usually to a specific region and specific items. The waivers this time covered a laundry list of like 650 commodities and were nationwide. This was the first time there's something they call it Section 510 B was used and A should have been used, or it might be vice versa, but they used something that was much more far-reaching. In the past, it was always, when you had a hurricane, there'd be a waiver related to, moving oil or gasoline to Puerto Rico for a couple of months. So a lot of things about these, while 185 voyages is a lot, when you dig into them, you see that a lot of what was moving, it was really just kind of inconsistent with the purpose. I did a pretty detailed article for the Center for Maritime Strategy. I won't go through that, but it kind of went through what the costs were, how much could reasonably be saved, and kind of concluded that if you take the most reasonable figure for the additional cost of a Jones Act tanker and you compare that to the price increase, I would admit that 1/8,000th of the price increase was mitigated by the Jones Act waivers. So the point is, it didn't really move the needle. What's kind of an overriding, and I've also done over going back to even before these waivers, I've done over a dozen articles, mostly in Median, really focused on Cato, who's been kind of the key player behind the scenes on this. And Cato has been attacking the Jones Act for since 2019 now. And I've really gotten delved into and seen the history of what Cato's doing and developed some very strong views that it's a very it's really not research, even though Cato's a reputable think tank. What the Cato folks that are involved in that, it's It's little more than lobbying. Ironically, they have a part of Cato called the Stifel Center for Trade Studies, and it kind of sounds very erudite. And what I've found out is that the fellow that is the only person in that, 100% of his work has been related to the Jones Act. Technically, the Jones Act, because it's part of the U.S., really isn't even a trade study, and it's been very disingenuous. Very strong misrepresentations. I could go through numerous. Most of my articles would attack one specific misnomer. For instance, a few years ago, kind of apropos to this, Colin Grabo at Cato said that without the Jones Act, consumers on the East Coast would save $4.5 billion a year. And I dug into the numbers and found a whole bunch of errors, first starting with the amount per gallon, which he had at more than 10 cents, and it's no more than 2 cents, even for a shipment that moves. Where he really made and he had to know this was a purposeful error, he assumed that ridiculous, 10 cents, which was 5 times more, would apply to all of the gallons of gasoline consumed on the East Coast, when in fact, I think it was only 6%. So it came together to be a 50 times overstatement, and they knew they were doing it. Another case, they promoted a study, and Cato's been doing it for so long that they've gotten other think tanks to be kind of an echo chamber, and they come out with the same thing. And I think so many people have been hearing for so long the misstatements by Cato that they think there's reality to it. What they always focus on is the build multiple, which they exaggerate, but in the Jones Act, the ship, the crew cost and the build multiple is just one part. In the container space, everything related to the ship is only about 1/3 of your cost. And your biggest ship cost, fuel, obviously isn't impacted. If you go through the real numbers, and I'll be the first to admit the Jones Act has a cost, but in the container space, it's about 15 or 20% at most. And so Cato goes around making people think if the Jones Act goes away, rates will go down by a factor of 5, and that just isn't true. One study that they promoted, another think tank that kind of was an echo chamber form, was an outfit called Hawaii Grassroots, and they came out with what purported to be a big, long study where they concluded that the Jones Act cost folks in Hawaii $1.2 billion a year. I was able to point out that that was about 50% more than the total revenue that Matson and Horizon Lines got, and did the real numbers and came out with no more than about 130. Again, off by a factor of 8. That kind of 8 to 10 difference is a consistent thing you see with them. And what I came to find out also is that what Cato's really been going for is to get a waiver on the LNG. And I think, frankly, their work is supported by LNG interest, two in particular, a company called National Grid. Because LNG in the U.S., by the way, only moves to 2 places. It moves to Boston and it moves to Puerto Rico. Boston, because they converted all of their plants from coal to natural gas. The cheapest by far way of moving natural gas is by pipeline. Massachusetts and Boston assumed that they could get additional pipelines to move gas when they ran out of capacity, but Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York refused to let those pipelines go over New York. So they had to go to a plan B of moving LNG, which is significantly more expensive. And LNG, without going into the weeds, is a trade where the most expensive vessels move a relatively cheap cargo. So the most important economic are how close you are. Where we are, Trinidad and Tobago are the closest places. In fact, Trinidad and Tobago is closer to Boston than is the Sabine Pass, a little bit closer, 10%. But Trinidad kind of has a lock on that. And so what National Grid, which is a British utility, what I think they would want if the Jones Act went away, that would allow them to get a tighter price from Trinidad. But in all likelihood, that freight would still, the LNG would still move from Trinidad. In the case of San Juan, it's even more obvious. Trinidad is like 6 times closer. And the interesting thing, the outfit promoting, wanting the relief for the LNG and San Juan is called New Fortress Energy. They have a long-term contract to provide LNG to PREPA, the utility. I was able to get a copy of that contract. Even if the Jones Act were to go away and their improved economics, all of those economics stay with New Fortress. And so it makes smart sense on their point to spend a lot of money to do it, but it has nothing to do with the elements. And again, if the Jones Act went away for LNG, it'd still come most likely from Trinidad to Puerto Rico, but with a lower price. So it's just a lot of cockamamie that Cato is putting out, and you see it with their, it's no real research. They take other people's work and they mischaracterize it. Colin Graybow, over one 6-month period that I dug into it, had 11 tweets per day, 7 days a week. 100% of them were on the Jones Act. That's not research. That's just simply lobbying. Here's a review, and everybody knows this, but this is the number of U.S. flag ships in total by 5-year increment. We barely have, more than 200 ships today. Most of those are in the Jones Act, but again, this isn't too different. This is an even wider gap because the fleets of the world have grown, is our percentage of ocean-going ships. And it doesn't really move the needle, but this isn't too different than all Western industrial powers. All of the flags of convenience have taken over, the large majority of ships. Panama was actually created by the U.S., the Panama flag of convenience during World War II. So this is just a natural consequence. It's not particularly surprising, but the Jones Act today is kind of the heart of what we have. And the notion that we would do anything with that. And what has a lot of us puzzled is the extraordinary inconsistencies with all of these waivers. First and foremost, they're not achieving the purpose that they said. The president's press secretary said this was to relieve short-term problems in the oil market. Well, a lot of the best analysis, if you that I highlighted in my CMS article, concluded that the total cost savings from lower Jones Act movements of gasoline would be something like 2/100ths of a cent of a gallon. You compare that to the total price increase, that's at 1/8,000th. So it's not achieving the purpose. There are just a lot of baffling things, commodities that are moving. For instance, there have been 3 voyages by a Chinese flag ship by Costco moving asphalt to Maryland. That's hardly a national security issue. Most of these voyages that involve petroleum are being driven. The other thing that they're not talking about is all of the pricing on these. Most of them are actually at or above the rates the Jones Act vessels get. In fact, some of them materially above. And the reason for that, it goes back to why these voyages are occurring. We had a major dislocation in the oil market that created arbitrage opportunities. For instance, California's price went up something like $1.50 a gallon versus a nationwide average of $1.10. That led to an arbitrage situation. You have trading companies that are indifferent to how much they pay for freight, but if they can lock in something and they could pay, $1 million a day to run a tanker, if that works out to a profit, they're going to do that. That has nothing to do with a real underlying market. So they're not achieving the purpose they were set out to do. They are also, however, hindering initiatives that are underway in long-term goals. Things like the Korean shipyard in Philadelphia, a fascinating company, Saronic Technologies, what they're doing and actually building vessels and eventually hope to be building commercial vessels. Those are all initiatives that are kind of fundamentally based on the rules that were in play when they made those investments. So there's a fundamental unfairness to that. And it also is inconsistent with the long-term goals that have been articulated by this administration. What's amazing to me is there probably hasn't been any administration that has had so many initiatives and stated plans and actual actions that are beneficial to the maritime sector, from shipbuilding to others across the board, and to, in the middle of that, to kind of take a knife to the heart of the merchant marine is just really baffling. I mean, again, where you have Chinese ships and Russian ships going into U.S. ports in the interior, when the same administration wanted to put in place these USTR fees on Chinese ships. It would be up to $10 million a port call just for a Chinese ship visiting, and then to turn around and say, well, we don't want Chinese built ships but it's fine with the Costco ship to have 3 voyages to move asphalt. It's just nonsensical. So we'll kind of quickly review what I see going on in the broader maritime sector. This is a chart that I've been maintaining for a long time. I have to keep on shortening it because, what happened maybe 8 years ago doesn't matter. But this is looking at the month, year-over-year gains in inbound volume to the U.S. And the red line is a trailing 3-month average. And here you see the roller coaster that, was the pandemic, where our inbound volume to the top 10 ports was up, in some cases more than 50%. We had the back end of that, where again the year-over-year comparisons had a bigger reduction, and then we got back to some strength. More recently, we've come back. And we've had 2 events that'll be more clear in a chart that I'll show you later. But the pandemic, and then we had kind of a minor kind of duplication of the pandemic was what happened in the Red Sea. We're now in kind of the throes of potentially a third, even smaller and probably more short-lived, but the situation in Iran. And you see that in the far right-hand side of the chart, where for the past 2 months, the inbound volume into the U.S. is ripped. Now, in my view, that is almost entirely front-end loading, and I've gone through an analytical exercise to kind of define that and see it at least about 2/3. But in June, our year-over-year volume was up 14%. It was up 15% the month before in May. And, again, that's not a natural strength. I think that's mostly shippers front-end loading out of fear that tariffs are going to come and be even higher. And it turned out that fear has been accurate. Here we're looking at kind of a inbound versus outbound, with the inbound obviously in the red and the outbound in the blue. And despite the roller coaster ride in terms of inbound, and this is with all ports, which I've always found when you aggregate figures, you have much more of a story. Many of you all are used to looking at the figures that come out from one port, and what you'll find is a very kind of zigzaggy when you're looking at one port. And when you combine a group of ports or a coastal range, more story is kind of told. And so here you see the rather dramatic and volatile movement of the inbound against a very stagnant and broadly kind of weaker outbound, which has been more often than not declining by small amounts, and last year is kind of rotating around 0. I think much of those declines, unfortunately, are the flip side of the first group of tariffs. And what I've come to find is that tariffs in the end don't impact overall volume as much as you think, but but they do impact outbound volume, and that's because they're retaliatory tariffs. And so that's kind of the flip of what people that are for tariffs want them to have. I could get into the numbers on a country by country basis, but interesting observation. It's clearly the volume of containers from China is down. It's down about 8 percentage points, and I'd like to compare a lot of things to 2019, which was before the pandemic and kind of a normalcy, and see what that is compared to now and what that CAGR is. But in 2019, something on the order of 42, 43% of our inbound containers came from China. The most recent month, it's about 8 percentage points less, and so that's a pretty big reduction. But when you look at two other points, the biggest switch, biggest increases over that same period have been inbound containers from Vietnam and Thailand. Many people understand, and it's proven that much of that increase is Chinese companies moving operations to there. There might even be a fair amount of actual cheating, although nobody would admit to that, but actual transshipments. And if you look at that, the increase from Vietnam and Thailand is actually a little bit more than the reduction from China. So if you were to look at June of 2026 to 7 years earlier, June of 2019, the inbound containers from China, Vietnam, and Thailand as a group, and they are, by the way, the three largest country origins for containers now, are slightly higher than they were in 2019. This is a kind of a similar look, but kind of a look at the coastal range, and I have a following this clear. But here, what you kind of see is more consistent growth in the East Coast and Gulf Coast ranges, and a lot of that has to do with just population dynamics. Those areas have been growing more, but the biggest reason, quite frankly, is just underlying cost economics. If you look at the distribution of the population in the U.S., despite California's very dense population, a lot of the interior states in the West are the opposite. And I've taken the time to look at every state in the union and kind of measure which one is closer to which coast, and kind of hypothetically say that, the closer you are to a coast, the more efficient that transportation would be to go to that coast. And what you end up with is that while the population mix in the U.S. is like 55-45 East Coast, Gulf Coast to West Coast, no, I'm sorry, the inbound containers, that 55-45. If you look at the population mix, it's more like 76-24. And in the end, containers are going to go to where people are. I mean, that was one of Malcolm McLean's constant sayings, and oftentimes scolding somebody like me, John, containers go to where people are. And so I'm not suggesting that you'll ever have that mix, but that's where the population is. And more importantly, if that's where they're going to eventually end up, it's more cost efficient to move them a little bit closer by water. This is kind of that same data looked at it another way. This is kind of over, I guess, the last 7 years, and looking at the percentage coming off the West Coast. And you can clearly see a downward slant that picked up, after the Panama Canal expansion, because when the Panama Canal couldn't handle anything much bigger than 4,400 TEU, that had a little bit of a built-in constraint. That's now been removed. So I don't think, I think this trend will continue. I think right now that 7 years is about 40, 45 basis points a year on the switch. I think you'll see something like 30 basis points, 25 basis points at least. This is another chart of that same data. And I like to highlight this because what it puts it a little more in perspective. And when you're looking at those year over year changes, particularly when you have that roller coaster effect and you're kind of comparing a strong year this year versus a weak year last year, those percentages kind of jump off. And sometimes people have kind of thought that, well, we just had an unusual amount of volume during the pandemic. That was the problem. This chart kind of highlights. I mean, you can see in the recent past, there have been a couple of months that are right up there with the biggest month we ever had during the pandemic. This is kind of color coding it, taking the red is East and Gulf Coast. The light blue is the giant biggest port in the U.S. inbound is Los Angeles, and then the blue is other West Coast. The other thing that's kind of interesting also, and that this is favors the West Coast, the East Coast rather, is kind of the balance between ports, and we're seeing a kind of a growing gap in terms of the imbalance of the West Coast ports versus the other. And within the ports, you can get into all sorts of distinctions, but clearly some of those same trends that have affected the coastal range are driving who are the best and on the other side, the worst performers. And so consistently, one of the better performers is Houston, which has not only had the highest growth in container volume and probably one of the prime beneficiaries of a move eastward, but it also has been very balanced. Houston has had many months where inbound loads are, only 1.1 times outbound loads. You contrast that with LA, and it's 4.2 inbound loads for every outbound load. Everything else equal, that increases the cost for everybody. Here we're taking a look at the net income of the sector. And this is kind of on a quarterly basis going back to 2016. These are in billions of dollars. And so there was that one quarter where the industry had net profits of over $60 billion. I study these numbers pretty religiously when they come out. About two-thirds of the container carriers in the world are public. And so you can access their numbers. It takes a little digging, and the disclosure rules in Taiwan and certainly China aren't what we're used to in the U.S. And you have to kind of convert it into U.S. dollars. But the two-thirds of the companies that report their results, I then kind of interpolate the balance with the big one, of course, being MSC, based on their having the same results on a per capacity basis. So I'm highly confident that this really represents not only the trend, but pretty close to the actual of the entire industry if you had all of those companies. And so that bias not only MSC, but it's every other container company among the 100 or so that have scheduled service. And what you see here is the rapid ascent. For 8 straight quarters, the industry set a new record in terms of net income, an even faster descent, and then you had kind of a mini duplication of that related to the Red Sea. And ironically, that occurred beneficially for the industry right at the time that they turned a small loss in that fourth quarter, right before the Red Sea kicked in. And with that going around the long way on a lane that was something on the order of 25% of worldwide container miles, that immediately had the effect of yanking capacity, because it was 30% longer, yanking about 8% of the capacity out of the industry. And you see the beneficial effects. Certainly didn't go as high, but it had kind of the same event. We're going to be looking at kind of a mini replay of that with the situation coming out of the Iran war, where pricing is definitely ramped up well beyond what the fuel surcharge went up. And second quarter numbers aren't out, but they will be nicely above first quarter. This is the kind of the same data, but used as a percentage of net income. And in my reports over the quarters, particularly the ones that we peaked at, that always managed to get some quotes when I would compare the profit margin of the container shipping industry to low margin businesses like Facebook and Microsoft and Apple and all of the FANG companies. And in fact, I am certain that in that peak quarter where the total industry's net income to profit was something north of 46%, that's a record for an industry. I don't think there's ever been an industry where the whole industry has had that kind of performance. I'll share with you that there was one individual company that publicly reports its results that within a 6-month period had a net income to revenue margin, if I recall, about 72%. And of course, part of those margins were made possible by the very interesting tax situation that shipping has, where for the most part, income tax is based on the tonnage tax of the vessel and isn't a percentage versus the economic net income. Now, for most of shipping's life, that actually hasn't helped it. Now, maybe that's the way it should be. The industry with the greatest, tax shield doesn't get to use it. But during the pandemic, they did in a very big way. This is my last slide, and this kind of highlights what drove that profit. And I always like to kind of highlight to folks when I'm talking about the industry about pricing and how the importance of how pricing is misunderstood is maybe too strong, but is too much attention, in my view, is given to the spot pricing indexes, and with some people viewing that represents the real pricing. These two graphs are the two major indices in terms of aggregate pricing meaning all of the loads that move. And that comes out from container trade statistics, which is actually, not only is that not an estimate like all of the other indices, that is actually data from the carriers themselves that is put in an index form. And that compared to the blue line, which is the SCFI, which is the most popular. Now, my view is that spot pricing to a real shipper, and a real shipper to me is a Walmart, is a Home Depot, is a Target. They always move freight with contracts. They're not in the business of rolling the dice and playing the market and seeing what the spot is. When you buy 1 million footballs in China, you pay a given price and you want to know what the shipping cost of that is going to be. Spot pricing in the container shipping industry really came about as a way of the industry dealing with the intermediaries, and there are significant a number of intermediaries because they weren't willing, quite appropriately, to give a fixed price to an intermediary who, if the market turned, would then kind of sell against them. But what's interesting when you look at this, and I've had people debate with me and say that I understand that spot pricing is the current pricing, and it just takes time for the contracts to catch up with that. And what is patently obvious when you look at this graph is that contract prices are not renewing, at whatever the spot price is when the contract comes in place. And so I think the spot indices, and I have a lot of issues about the credibility of those. At the same time, I watch them closely. There's an information content, but I never delude myself into thinking that the spot price is what things are moving, on that given day. And I dare say that spot prices can be often very very effectively used by carriers to get the best contract price they can. So it really doesn't really represent much of the real market. So if there's any takeaway from this presentation, besides the volatile nature of where things are and where they're going to continue, it's that pricing, what really matters is the pricing of everything. So I'll close with, sorry about that. I'll close with just kind of highlighting what I think most of us know, but is becoming painfully obvious, each month. There has been a real paradigm shift in how the container shipping industry operates, and I dare say that could be kind of summarized to from advantage shippers to advantage carriers, and much of that, all of that, is driven by more capacity management by the carriers. So it's incumbent upon everybody that is involved in the industry or certainly deals with the industry and negotiates freight rates to study and focus on all the available facts. I throw out my website and my reports where one can get additional information on that. So with that, I'm finished. I think I pretty much kind of kept to the 30 minutes, Stas, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions anybody might have.
Thank you very much, John. Let me start by asking you, we saw from Cato the movements of a number of ships. They showed us the MARAD map, and there was all of these lines going from the Gulf to California, and with the implication that this was going to help California. Our gasoline prices were higher, and you kind of addressed that. But what was going on there? Why were all of those ships going west?
Well, first to underscore, at all times, the increase in California has been meaningfully more than the rest of the world, and so that created what I believe is what somebody would just say is an arbitrage situation. Clearly, I guess California was impacted by supply, but once you get into a situation where there's a clear need for something, you've kind of moved beyond identifying kind of what's a natural demand. It's kind of like if you've been walking in the desert for 5 days, what you would pay for a bottle of water isn't indicative of what a bottle of water is worth, to make a kind of a different analogy. And so I think much of those related to arbitrage, and the California market has always been different, and this is getting into a granular level that I don't know, but I know that California has different. California has always been kind of a fuel island apart from the rest of the country in terms of what needs to be in the fuel, and so to the extent that the fact that they had a higher increase suggests that there was even more of a demand for that, and refineries made more of that. But again, I think it's a natural arbitrage, and I go back to the point. What was interesting, Cato's refrain, prior to the waivers, has always been about pricing. I mean, I've the number of they said, and what's amazing is how precious few of the routes that there was a time that Cato would say, man, if there was no Jones Act, again, going back to that example, they used the example of the Jones Act is costing East Coast consumers $4.5 billion a year, and literally at that time, like 6% of the gas on the East Coast came by tanker. And Cato would say, if there was no Jones Act, boy, you're going to see massive reductions. Well, we've had this Jones Act waiver. How many of that 185 voyages, precious few, are from the Gulf to the East Coast? Another observation that doesn't fit with what Cato is always trying to say, by far, the biggest part of the Jones Act, the Jones Act, there are mainly two sectors, tanker, and the biggest part of the tanker sector is from the Gulf Coast to Florida. And that's for the simple reason that Florida does not have any pipelines. They decided that, that's not environmentally, that's the cheaper way of moving gasoline is pipelines. That's where gasoline moves. Well, Florida has gas prices that average about 20 cents a gallon less. So that is kind of counter to what they're saying. The other the biggest, and so you have about $1 billion a year in tanker related revenue in the Jones Act. The other much bigger market, 3.5 billion, is containers. And going back to that figure that I mentioned, 15 or 20%, that would be, that would be clearly the cost that would come out of the Jones Act. And I can assure you that those carriers aren't making that kind of profit. So if the Jones Act went away, you would very quickly see foreign carriers come in and probably push those U.S. flag carriers out. And the reason they would do that in particular is that all of a sudden, most of, as we saw on that chart, and certainly to the West Coast, West Coast, something like 3.5 to 1 inbound containers versus each outbound container. In contrast, the Jones Act is an outbound trade. So if the Jones Act were to go away tomorrow, if I were NYK, I would add a outbound Hawaii call, when I'm coming out of Los Angeles. Very little deviation. That's just additional gravy. And so what would quickly happen in Hawaii and Alaska to a less extent, but Hawaii definitely, is those trades would become a stop by. Gone would be the shuttle service. And so, yes, you would probably easily could see 15 or 20% less rates going there. You would also see the inbound, the pineapples that come from Hawaii, the fish from Alaska, those all of a sudden, and those rates are dirt poor because they're mostly empty. All of a sudden, they're not going to have to compete with the head haul from Asia. And so imagine if you're a shipper that relies on that. And by the way, those outbound shippers are the ones that employ people. All of a sudden, you're looking at like a 5, a 6, a 8-fold increase in your rates, and it even gets worse. Not only do your rates go up, but you've got to put it on in Hawaii. It's got to stay on there all the way through Asia. And so when you go through that, it becomes patently clear that how quickly the Jones Act would change the domestic container trade. And it could even get worse. We all know during the pandemic, the carriers made decisions that were in their best interests. They said, forget about that load of almonds coming out of California. That doesn't really pay a lot. And when I turn that piece of equipment over, it takes up time. I'm just going to load that empty box and I'm going to skedaddle back to Asia to get one of those $10,000 loads as quick as we can. They did that. Why wouldn't that same NYK, which set up service to Hawaii, say, Hawaii, I know we used to be weekly. We're going to go every other week because we're going to go to Asia. And so you're really kind of locking yourself to a whipsaw in contrast to the very stable, very predictable service you have.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Now, I'm going to open this up to questions. If anybody's got a question, raise your hand and let me know, because we've still got some time here. And I will keep, okay, Jackson, go ahead.
Thanks, Stas, and really appreciate your presentation, John. So I just have a question. Are you seeing AI being used by the carriers and maybe large shippers as well to kind of assist their negotiations? If you're moving 2 million TEUs a year, you're Walmart importing that many containers a year. There's some deals being done, but at the end of the day, are you seeing these new tools being used to determine what the math should be?
Well, before I get to that, let me highlight, Jackson, it's nice to connect with you again. As I recall,
yes.
we first connected, Jackson was a graduate of Colgate, where my son was, I think, a couple of years behind you. And I'm glad to see your. I could tell from your interest in international, but I'm glad to see that you're at one of the top maritime law firms. So AI is changing the world, but right now, probably a little bit of a less effect on the carriers themselves. There was a, and I'm not dismissing it at all, but at the end of the day, hard assets matter, and so that's where there's still a lot of focus. A much bigger issue, and maybe AI could be helpful, is kind of the industry kind of thinking through what is if it is to move to less carbon, what is the propulsion system of the future? I mean, that's kind of a continuous overhang in terms of decisions to be made. And I think it probably help them, and I wouldn't be surprised if AI kind of points to my favorite if one's really committed to doing that. It's the small modular nuclear reactors, kind of low pressure. But yeah, I'm sure that AI is being used. I guess where the carriers might throw in a whole bunch of data and make use of AI, quite frankly, would be on blanking sailings, and which is the tool of capacity management. And I guess they could, when you get into blanking sailings, you get into an interesting, what is cause and what is effect. It's one thing, in the position of the carriers, and by the way, the ability to blank sailings has been exponentially increased by the carrier alliances. And the reason for that is simple, because if you're in an alliance, let's take a typical service to the West Coast from Asia, weekly service, string of 5 vessels. And let's say you got 3 or 4 carriers that have that, and each have 5 vessels in a weekly service. It'd be unusual to see any one of those carriers say, "Okay, well, I'm gonna go to effectively cut out one sailing, reduce my capacity 20%." The other carriers would like that, but that's kind of a big position. But if those same 4 carriers are in an alliance where they have 20 vessels, then all of a sudden, if the alliance cuts one of the vessels out, that's 5%. And so it's an ability to kind of fine tune that. And I always find myself kind of constantly thinking, well, how, and the whole concept of the alliance, and it makes sense. The idea is, look, we're not doing anything wrong. We're not doing any pricing, but by sharing these assets, there are economies, and those economies make the system have less cost. And how can that not benefit? And that does occur. But if I'm not, it's not clear to me that people kind of saw how this blank sailing situation could arise. And when if a carrier says, well, okay, it doesn't make any sense for us to run capacity where there's not demand. Blank sailings then are kind of the effect. If, on the other hand, it's kind of like, well, we're kind of at equilibrium, why don't we blank a sailing? Then that kind of becomes the cause. And my observation during the pandemic, and it worked out to you ended up having in my view, a forced experiment that the carriers literally had their back up against the wall. The old saying, when your back's up against the wall and you have no choice. And when the pandemic first started, I, like everybody, thought, okay, there's going to be a jolt to to volume. And I was thinking, and I think many people thought, okay, you have the financial crisis as one marker. You know, it's like 10%, you know, a very short period of time due to trade financing. I think most people thought it was that. And so they cut dramatically capacity. As it turned out, they had the benefit of probably overcutting, you know, not intentional. And then you got into a situation where the volume started to ramp up, and so you really found yourself throughout the pandemic in a situation where demand was ahead of capacity. And the carriers saw the impact that had on their results. And so one would be hard pressed to think that there's not going to be a desire to, where they can, duplicate that.
We've got a question from Bruce. Bruce, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. I know we might be slightly over the time, but you meant, and thank John, that was a really great presentation. You know, with the Ships Act and the Maritime Action Plan and all the focus on increasing the number of shipyards and more U.S. based mariners and trying to build up the academies. It seems like that. Why are they doing the Jones Act waiver to kind of shoot themselves in the foot? Sorry for not being politically correct.
It's a good question.
No,
John.
no, you asked the threshold question that I ask every day, and there's not a sensical answer to it. My concern, I guess, one sensical answer is that that maybe that some of the other things are perhaps a little more fluffy. You know, they're kind of said because they know they kind of resonate. I happen to think that this Jones Act waiver, the extension, and now seems to be some serious consideration of a further extension.
Yeah.
You know, even with a letter from 52 Republican congressmen, including the Speaker of the House, I think it's part of perhaps something else. I don't, you know, there's some reports that there's some elements that are thinking maybe we can get Korea or Japan to build certain smaller military vessels. And I guess if they were to do that, I guess one would say, well, we can't, you know, we can't be more liberal with our military ships than we are with commercial. I don't know, that's speculation, but I think it's dishonorable. I really do, and it makes me wonder if some of these other initiatives are more kind of well, we'll say that, you know, but we don't really need to follow through with it. It's kind of a three-card Monty, and it really is, you know, and I personally think it'd be despicable to do it, even if the Jones Act and the Merchant Marine didn't continue to have an effect. I'll share one final story that sticks with me, and this was a few years back, maybe 10 years back. There was a conference and shipping folks, and a senior executive at General Dynamics was speaking, and obviously this was a partisan crowd, supported, you know, our maritime base, et cetera, et cetera. And this speaker got up and he said, you know, we think the Jones Act won the Cold War. Well, even among partisans, their jaw was slacking. And then he went on to say, General Dynamics, of course, owns Electric Boat. And he said, well, we believe that our quiet submarines earned, you know, won the Cold War, but we equally don't think that we could have that without the system that the Jones Act puts in place. I mean, it's not just building ships, it's naval architects, it's the intellectual capital.
Yep.
It's having billets where we have people that can be trained. I mean, we can always buy ships in theory, but they can't be operated by somebody like me. I mean, you need somebody that knows what they're doing. So I couldn't agree with you more. You find yourself thinking, why would anybody be stupid enough to even pull a thread?
So is the Cato Institute the tip of the spear, or are there 10 other conservative right-wing groups behind them? Because Cato is aligned with Heritage Foundation and a whole bunch of extremely well-funded uh, groups that are theoretically for freedom. They define liberty as unregulated, untrammeled enterprise. Okay, fine. Jones Act is a regulation, but it has preserved 140 shipyards around the country. And like you just said, without the Jones Act, those would disappear. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
The factoids of the wind farm ships that Norway or what's the big one out there? It's 3 times more money for us to build it in Texas or New England than it is to just have Norway bring over a ship. And I appreciate all that. I do have a dog in this fight, but we could not get rid of all our welders, like you said, ship architects, and all the ancillary businesses that it supports. It's a real industry, and
Really is. Yeah.
I can't see turning this over to the international trade, especially when it gets to military. So is Cato, who's Cato working for? That's my real question.
Well,
I think
go ahead, John.
Well, I think Cato's really working kind of as a lobbyist, and I've been able.
Right.
They have an annual
Right,
report, and I've seen about 300,000 or 400,000 a year of additional corporate contributions came on when this one person who expends their time exclusively on that. So I think they're kind of being. I think they believe it, but I think they're being funded to push that, and I think it's primarily from LNG sources. New Fortress, National Grid. British utility. New Fortress is owned by SoftBank, the big Japanese financial conglomerate. I think you have British Petroleum in there. There are some think tanks, particularly American Enterprise Institute, who's done a lot of Me Tooing to Cato. American Enterprise Institute had a British fella that wrote a paper saying, well, we need to change the Jones Act and allow British flag vessels to be carry for the Jones Act. I think he was carrying water for British Petroleum. I did a little digging and found out that this one professor who's an agricultural specialist had received a $5 million grant from the Koch brothers. Now, I should say Koch is an ardent enemy of the Jones Act. Well, the Koch brothers, founded Cato. It used to be called something Koch. But I think the Cato is more than just the spearhead. They're most of it, and they've been repeating the same talking points. Again, I go back to this point that Colin Brabo, tweets 11 tweets a day, all on the Jones Act, and they're all kind of silly, repetitive, non-supported talking points. He's been saying them so long, and so many people have said them, and they managed to get even reputable magazines like Forbes to repeat this, what is just total garbage analysis. And so that is had some effect. They came very close in the summer of 2020 to getting a waiver of the Jones Act for LNG. And when the congressmen and senators in the Louisiana found out about it, they stopped it. But so I think it's probably more Cato than you think.
Okay.
Yeah, this is one area where Xi Jinping of China and Putin and BP all align. And it just feels very dangerous for the next 20 years.
So I think that we're going to be coming to a close on this, but I want to say, John, this is very helpful that you pinpointed where some of these pressure points are. When I talked to Jennifer Carpenter, the head of the American Waterways Operators, the first thing that she said to me is the oil companies are really benefiting, and that validates your observations as well, because before they were moving cargoes and fuel by rail. Now they could get a foreign flag ship to do it, but it's got nothing to do with gasoline prices. The gasoline prices are really not affected because, as you said, it's arbitrage. And the other thing that you've noticed is that we've done a lot of front loading. We really didn't get to talk as much as we might have about that. But the question is, what's going to happen to ports for the rest of 2026? And that is a big issue because we have new tariffs in. People were worried that they were going to come in. We saw unseasonably high volumes coming in. And as you warned, people were getting a little happy about this, saying, oh, look, I'm up 15%, I'm up 18%. But the big question is, what's going to happen for the rest of the year? And that's a big question mark. And on that note, I want to thank everybody, especially John, for being here, for providing his information. This is being recorded, so everybody who's on this call will be getting a copy of this. And it's got John's slides, so you can follow his analysis and what is going on. And John, I want to thank you very, very much for providing this kind of data, which we really, really don't get. And you've done a really great job for us, and we are very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Everybody have a great rest of the day.
Okay, John, thank you very much. And the Propeller Club is going to be having Peter Schneider from IMC Trucking on Tuesday, September 8th, to talk about cargo theft, and that will be at Scott Seafood. And that announcement will be coming out shortly. I want to thank everybody for being here and hope that you are well. It's going to be an interesting rest of 2026. And, we've said before, it's a real beware of living in interesting times, and we are having those. So thank you very much, everybody. See you soon. Thank you for participation. And we will be back in September, and we may have an update presentation in August. I'll know about that in a day or two. So I'm Stas Margaronis, Propeller Club of Northern California. We thank you. Be well, be safe. Take care.